Good morning. My name is Geoffrey Nice and I am chairman of the China Tribunal. My 6 colleagues and I will each introduce ourselves at the end of these introductory remarks that will last just under 15 minutes. This tribunal has been established by the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, ETAC, which is an Australian charity comprised of a coalition of lawyers, academics, ethicists, medical professionals, researchers, and human rights advocates dedicated to ending forced organ harvesting in China. ETAC's full program and objectives can be seen on its website. There have been many reports into China's transplant practices, but none of them explores specifically whether those practices have involved international criminal offences, although it is often asserted that they may have done. This tribunal will investigate if criminal offences have been committed by state or state-approved bodies or organisations or by individuals in China that or who may have engaged in forced organ harvesting. This tribunal, a people's tribunal, was formed by ETAC but is completely independent of it. People's tribunals. This tribunal will become a member of a growing family of informal or people's tribunals, each dealing with allegations of extremely serious crimes by states or state-supported bodies that formal national and international bodies have failed to deal with. The first noted People's Tribunal was Lord Russell's into Vietnam, and there have been others since, such as the Comfort Women Tribunal, the Iran Tribunal, the Indonesia Tribunal, each building on the experience of earlier tribunals and each having individual approaches to rule of law and procedural issues generated by the particular allegations made. Factors specific to this tribunal and its procedure. This tribunal, it should be remembered, will be dealing with allegations where, by the very nature of what is alleged, there can be no in-person evidence from victims, all of whom will be dead if the allegations are correct. For this tribunal, it was decided not to have a panel of people already knowledgeable about or particularly concerned about allegations of forced organ harvesting that have already been made in various reports. Nor is it a panel of lawyers making legal decisions to apply to facts the tribunal may find. Rather, it is composed of 7 people, 4 lawyers from 4 different countries with experience of different human rights fields of activity, a transplant surgeon, a businessman, and an historian knowledgeable of China, who will act collectively in deciding what is proved to have happened and what are the consequences in law for the findings made. The expertise of all panel members will be deployed in the panel's questioning of witnesses, where appropriate, and in discussion amongst ourselves where that may be necessary for technical, legal, medical, cultural, or other matters to be fully understood. But all panel members act as equal, who in no way profess to being expert in the final questions facing the tribunal, so that effectively this panel will resemble, at least to a degree, a jury in criminal trials in those countries that have a jury system. The procedure will not be adversarial. China is not appearing as a party, and there will be no advocate to make allegations for ETAC. Instead, ETAC has presented the tribunal with written material for reading before these hearings and has largely been responsible for identifying the 30 or so witnesses who will be appearing over the next 3 days. The full list of pre-read material is published on the website of the tribunal, and witnesses will be identified as they come to give evidence, with one, I think, probably having the benefit of anonymity for security reasons. Subject to individual consents, witnesses' written witness statements will also be published on the website after their evidence has been given. Counsel to the tribunal, Mr. Hamid Sabi, sitting there, or one of his team, will summarise the evidence in a witness's written statement as the witness comes to give evidence, and the witness will be asked to give evidence of central parts of her or his evidence before being asked further questions by tribunal members. During the 3 days of witness testimony, it may be that the tribunal will identify further documents it considers it should have and read, or indeed further witnesses from whom it would like to hear. There has also been a call for evidence possibility on the China Tribunal website, whereby members of the public may contribute statements or indeed identify further evidence that the tribunal may wish to consider. In consequence, it is probable, certain in reality, that there will have to be a further hearing or hearings by one means or another to complete the reception by the tribunal of evidence, including the evidence that the tribunal itself will have identified as possibly valuable. In this way, and to this extent, the tribunal itself will have an investigatory function during and following these 3 days of hearing witnesses. There will be what's known as free assessment of evidence, with no rules limiting acceptance of evidence, such as rules of corroboration. But the tribunal will take note of various approaches made to evidence around the world and set out how it has approached evidence of all kinds in its judgment. The law. Consistent with this general approach, issues of law will be dealt with as follows. Legal experts from around the world have been approached to give legal advice on certain possible factual conclusions that the tribunal may reach, but entirely without prejudice to the factual findings that the tribunal will actually make. These experts have been asked to express their opinions in short form, similar to directions of law that might guide a jury or a panel of judges deciding a criminal case in a court. If the legal advice from different experts coincides, then there may be no need to hear from those witnesses in person. Otherwise, the tribunal will hear from the experts and will identify, following discussion by the tribunal members, the applicable law. It is hoped that any hearing with expert lawyers, just as with any hearings of witnesses identified already as possibly going to be giving evidence because identified by the tribunal as potentially useful, it's hoped that any such hearings can be in public, even if the hearings are conducted over the internet. As a minimum, video recordings of evidence from additional factual witnesses and discussions, if any, with expert witnesses will be posted on the tribunal's website. Notification of the timetable of all subsequent procedures of the tribunal following these 3 days of evidence will be posted on the website, with explanation of how they may, if technically possible, be viewed in real time. Exculpatory material or material showing that there was no criminality. ETAC and the tribunal are both aware of the need to have access to individuals who, or material that, suggests nothing criminal has been involved in China's organ transplant practices, and the panel would be grateful for notification of any such individuals or material that it may not have yet had drawn to its attention. Written material to this effect is already included in the pre-read material. Individuals who are known in the past to have given evidence to the effect that there is no criminality, have been written to, inviting their participation as witnesses. None has been available to assist the tribunal thus far. Invitations to the People's Republic of China. Written invitations to attend these hearings have been sent on 2 occasions to the Ambassador of the People's Republic of China to the United Kingdom. Those invitation letters also invited consideration to be given by China to participating in the proceedings in some way, following discussion with Mr. Sabi, counsel to the inquiry. No reply has been received to either letter. Mr. Sabi will each day of these hearings ask publicly whether anyone in the room represents the People's Republic of China. Proof. Although this is not in any sense a criminal trial of an individual, the tribunal will apply the presumption of innocence, will allow no presumptions or assumptions of any kind to play part in its deliberations, will make its decisions on the basis of evidence considered by all of its members and nothing else. Any finding without qualification that commission of crimes has been proved will be based on the tribunal members being satisfied of such a finding beyond reasonable doubt. Other findings, one way or another at lesser levels of certainty, will be explained in the judgment. Administrative matters. ETAC has funded hire of this hearing room, of audio-visual services and of interpreters. These last 2, it is understood, have been provided at favourable rates, for which the tribunal is appreciative. ETAC has also funded necessary travel of those tribunal members coming from overseas and their hotel accommodation. Tribunal members, counsel to the inquiry Mr. Sabi, and all of the team working with him here today, who have prepared the material for use at these hearings and who will in due course assist in summarising evidence for the final judgment of the tribunal, have acted and will act at all times pro bono publico. None has any interest, financial or otherwise, in any outcome of the work of the tribunal or in the final judgment of the tribunal. Introductions. I, Geoffrey Nice, am an English barrister, formerly a part-time judge in England, who prosecuted war crimes cases for the UN between 1998 and 2006, and I've worked in associated areas ever since, including in 2 earlier informal or people's tribunals.
I'm Arthur Waldron. Since graduating from college in 1971, I have devoted myself to the study of Chinese history, culture, and language, and have lived a life which can only be described as deeply and inextricably involved with China. And as a result of this, I have ended up as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you.
My name is Andrew Koo. I'm a practicing advocate and solicitor in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. I was called to the Bar of England and Wales by the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn in November 1991 and to the Bar of the High Court of Malaya in Malaysia in May 1995. My practice these days, for the last 12 years, has been focused on human rights and fundamental liberties, both in Malaysia and generally. Thank you.
My name is Martin Elliott. I'm a professor of cardiothoracic surgery at University College London and a paediatric cardiothoracic surgeon at Great Ormond Street, which is a children's hospital near here. I've been involved in thoracic organ transplantation since 1988 and graduated in 1973, me doing cardiac surgery since 1978.
Nicholas Vetch. I'm the businessman with a increasing and deep involvement in human rights.
My name is Shadi Saad. I'm an Iranian human rights lawyer, and I was part of International People's Tribunal on Myanmar, as well as International People's Tribunal on Indonesia.
My name is Regina Paulos, and I am a U.S.-based international and criminal law and human rights attorney.
Himself, ask about anyone appearing on behalf of the People's Republic of China, set out today's timetable, and with his team will have the witnesses provided by ETAC give their evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Hamid Sabi. I'm originally from Iran. I'm counsel to this tribunal and have acted as counsel to Iran Tribunal as well. I have the benefit of my team, which I will introduce. Talks with first name only. Talks, Marcus, Tafa, Elia, and Tatiana. Anybody representing the People's Republic of China? That being the case, Mr. Chairman, maybe proceed with introducing our first witness.
Are you going to just set out the timetable so that we know when there will be breaks?
Yes, there will be a break at 2:15, basically in 2 hours' time.
And we would, I think, ask people, members of the public, so far as possible, not to come and go during a witness's evidence, but to wait until the witness is changed. It's distracting for the witness. Sometimes it's not possible, but we would ask you to do that.
Mr. Chairman, our first witness is Mr. David Mattis from Canada, who appears in person. And ladies and gentlemen, when we have the Chinese-speaking witnesses, I will ask you to put your headphones if you cannot understand Chinese, which will be translated simultaneously for you.
Mr. Mattis, good morning. Thank you for coming to give evidence to this tribunal. This tribunal has no ability to administer an oath, as you will understand. Nevertheless, it is important, of course, for us that you understand how it will help us if the evidence you give is, to your knowledge, the truth and nothing but the truth.
I understand, yes.
Good morning, Mr. Mattis. My name is Hamid Sabi, counsel to the tribunal. Next to you, there is a book that covers all the evidence, including yours. If you turn to page 1 of this document, it will be your written statement. Is this your statement? It runs for 7 pages.
Yes, yes, it is.
Would you like to make any changes?
No.
Mr. Mattis, you did investigate the organ transplantation in China and published your findings in a book. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain the details of the book that you published and the authors that assisted you in that investigation?
The book is the third version of a report that I did with David Kilgore. The first version was in 2006, the second version was in 2007, and the third version was in 2009. What prompted the report in the book was a statement by a woman with a pseudonym Annie, who made a public statement in March 2006 in Washington, D.C., saying that her ex-husband had been harvesting corneas of Falun Gong practitioners in Sujiatan Hospital in Shenyang City in Linang Province between 2001 and 2003. That other doctors had been harvesting other organs, that the organs were sold, some of them to transplant tourists, that the bodies were cremated. She made that statement. And the Chinese government immediately said this statement was wrong, that it was false. There was an NGO called the Coalition to Investigate Persecution Against Falun Gong that asked the Congressional Executive Commission on China to do something about it, and the Congressional Executive Commission said they couldn't without a human rights NGO report. The Coalition then constructed a name of 20 different people who could do this report. And I was on the list, and David Kilgore was on the list. The Coalition went to David Kilgore and asked him to join the other 19, and he said it was impractical for 20 people to do a report, that he could work with me because he knew me, and then they asked me, and I agreed to do that. Now, once I got that request, I knew what Falun Gong was, and I knew that Falun Gong were being persecuted, but I didn't know they were being persecuted in this particular way. And and I realized that straight up, it represented an evidentiary difficulty because to come to a conclusion one way or the other, because what we're told straight up is that the people who are victimized are dead, so you can't interview them. Their bodies are gone; they're cremated, so you can't autopsy them. Everything happens in an enclosed environment: prison, operating room, the hospital. Everybody who's a witness is complicit. There's no innocent bystanders. There would be records, but they would not be publicly accessible records. So the issue I faced and David Kilgore faced is whether this was true or not, and how do we establish it? Is this what Annie said? Is it provably true or is it provably false? And so what I tried to do was construct evidentiary trails of a wide variety of sorts that would either prove or disprove what Annie said. And I started off, we didn't have any, the coalition didn't give us any money, they didn't give us any data, they didn't give us any instructions, they just asked us to do this. And so I tried to, as I say, construct these evidentiary trails that would either prove or disprove. And I constructed a lot of various evidentiary trails, neither of which on their own was conclusive, but in combination led to a result. And in sum, the various evidentiary trails to disprove all went nowhere. The evidentiary trails of proof did establish some forms of proof that individually you could say maybe this establishes it, maybe it doesn't, but cumulatively put it all together, it was my conclusion and David Kilgore's conclusion that this was indeed happening. Not just between 2003 and 2005 when Annie's ex-husband was working, but from 2001, around that time until the time of our report and subsequent reports, not just in Sujiatan, but throughout China, and not just for corneas, for all organs. Now, because we were looking at an accumulation of evidence from a variety of evidentiary trails, to answer your question specifically about the details, it's, obviously very time-consuming, and I think it'd be, I would just refer you to our reports to look at the various evidentiary trails and how they led to the conclusion to which we came.
Thank you. In page 4 of your statement, Mr. Matters, you say that the conclusion was that Falun Gong practitioners have been and are being killed for their organs. And then you set out the basis for this conclusion. Can you briefly take the tribunal through your conclusions?
Yes. The conclusion was that the numbers were large. One of the problems, of course, we were dealing with is we were trying to deal with everything across China. We weren't trying to deal just with Sujiatan Hospital. And we would get anecdotal evidence, whistleblower evidence, every piece of individual evidence related to individual experience. So the question that we had was, how systemic is this? What's the scale? What are the numbers? And this was a continuing issue. We started off accepting the official figures of transplant volumes that the Chinese government produced. They said 10,000 a year. That's what we were looking at. And so we were asking, amongst other things, what's the source of those organs? And the Chinese officials switched. Originally their position was everything was coming from donations, but they didn't have a donation system. And then shortly after our report came out, the official position came everything was coming from prisoners sentenced to death and then executed. But then the question became, how many persons are being sentenced to death and then executed? And the Chinese government wouldn't then and doesn't now release those statistics. But the notion that it could all come from prisoners sentenced to death and then executed was problematic because there was no organ distribution at the time, so all organs had to be sourced locally. the law said execution had to be done 7 days after sentence, but people could book transplants in advance, and there was no coordination amongst patients. There was a high rate of hepatitis B amongst the criminal population in the prisons, which made many of their organs unusable. And so there was no, and of course you need blood type and tissue type compatibility. You couldn't use any prisoner for any patient. It is possible to overcome some types of tissue compatibility with or anti-rejection drugs, but the less the incompatibility, the better for the patient. And so it just wasn't an adequate explanation. And when it came to the actual numbers, we were trying to look at transplant death penalty volumes as best we could by looking at NGO estimates. Amnesty International, at some point they stopped, but at this point they were still doing estimates of death penalty volumes based on newspaper reports of executions. There was an NGO in Italy called Hands Off Cain that was doing death penalty estimates based on interviews with death penalty lawyers and extrapolating their caseloads. And so we were dealing with it that way. But at some point, a few years later, we decided, I mean, there was generally official Communist Party statistics are not reliable, and why should we be accepting the 10,000 a year statistic that they were generating? So that what we did is looked at that statistic, and it was a laborious but relatively simple exercise. We started going to the websites of individual hospitals, David Kilgore, myself, and Ethan Gutman, and adding up what the individual hospitals were doing. And they also had a registration system with minimum capacity, so we could also see what the minimum allowable was. And instead of getting 10,000 a year, we were getting 60 to 100,000 a year with the lower numbers in the earlier years, and as capacity increased, going up to 100,000, which, of course, and the death penalty during this period, number of offences, number of executions was going down. So that reinforced and amplified our conclusions about volume.
Thank you. I mean, in one way, you're saying that there was no negative proof that the alternatives are correct. But did you have any doubts as to the fact that Falun Gong practitioners are being used for organ harvesting?
Well, of course, I mean, what I was trying to do as I was going through the evidence is to question my own the evidence that I saw. I mean, the Chinese government, of course, rejected it, but their responses were not very responsive to the evidence. I mean, they said things like, I was anti-China, that my report was based on rumors, that I'm being manipulated by Falun Gong, which, I mean, that may have serve some propagandistic purpose, but I mean, I knew that I was not anti-China, and I knew that there was no rumors. As a lawyer, I rejected the hearsay rule, and I wasn't accepting hearsay evidence, and certainly I knew I wasn't being manipulated by Falun Gong. So it just, what they said wasn't very helpful in assessing the evidence, and I had to figure out my own ways of assessing the evidence. So, for instance, we would get these investigators calling into hospitals, pretending to be relatives of patients needing transplants, and asking the hospitals if they had organs of Falun Gong practitioners for sale, on the basis that the Falun Gong are healthy through their exercises and their organs would be healthy. And we got admissions in about 10 or 15% of the, about 15% of the cases. And we've got tapes and transcriptions and translations, and you can still hear those conversations today. So I had this evidence, and I was thinking, well, is there any other explanation for it besides the fact that they really are selling Falun Gong for their organs? So I thought, well, maybe the explanation is they're just trying to make a sale, and they're going to tell the caller what the caller wants to hear, whether it's true or not, and how's the caller going to verify anyway? So I mean, that's the kind of dialogue I had with myself, trying to assess each bit of evidence. And that's part of the reason why I said that I wanted to I came to a conclusion based on all the evidence rather than on simply part of it. But in relation to this particular bit about the calls, the Chinese government actually made a documentary about our report, which was in Mandarin, Phoenix TV, and they interviewed one of the people we called, Lu Guoping, and they presented him with a transcript of the conversation. They don't mention that there's a recording, they just give him a transcript, and they asked, "You get this call?" He said, "Yes." "Did you say these things?" He said, "Yes," except everything to do with Falun Gong. Everything else was there. But because they didn't mention that there was a recording, they didn't give any explanation how we could have interwoven seamlessly in our own, in his own voice, what he admitted having said and what he had denied having said. So, I mean, what the Chinese documentary was doing was accusing us of manipulating the transcript. But, I mean, obviously we didn't do that, and I knew we didn't do that. And to me, although this was meant to refute what we did, to me it was a kind of confirmation, because he acknowledged he got the call, and he acknowledged that he said, well, at least most of the things in it. So that's the kind of evidentiary debate I was having with myself as I was going through this report.
One final question from my side, Mr. Matos. There is an attachment to your report. If you look at it at page 8 of the book in front of you, it's the document entitled Canada Magnitsky Act Submission. Can you explain who authored this and what is your role in this document and what is it meant to demonstrate?
Well, Magnitsky legislation, Magnitsky was a lawyer in in Russia who was acting for a British businessman, William Browder, and Serge Magnitsky, and Browder had some assets in Russia that the Russian government officials wanted to seize, and Magnitsky was representing him, and Magnitsky was arrested, beaten, tortured, and killed in prison in Russia. And Browder, to his credit, didn't just walk away from this, but became a campaigner, an advocate to try to provide a remedy. And he started advocating legislation to get at the perpetrators. And there has been legislation which is called Magnitsky Act legislation, which has now been adopted in 6 countries, in UK, US, Canada, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And what the legislation does is it provides for public listing of international human rights violators. And the listing allows for their prosecution, it allows for their entry bans, and it allows for the seizing of their assets. And in Canada, most of the countries that have enacted it have enacted the list of names that Browder provided of the people who were involved in the murder of Magnitsky, but they've also expanded it to other countries as well. And in Canada, they listed Venezuelans, Sudanese, and so what some researchers in Canada have done is prepared what's called a Magnitsky brief to advocate the listing of some Chinese officials that have been involved in the persecution of Falun Gong and organ transplant abuse. And that's what that particular reference is. It's to that brief that's been prepared for Canada to propose the listing of some names under that legislation as international human rights violators who should be banned, who should be prosecuted, and whose assets should be seized.
And this document covers Wang Jifu?
Yes, there's a number of people listed there. Wang Jifu is one of them. Many of them are people who are involved generally in the apparatus for the repression of Falun Gong. But there's a few of them that are specifically involved in organ transplant abuse. Wang Jifu, Zhu Zhishen, Wang Lijian, who have been involved in organ transplant abuse.
Thank you, Mr. Matos. The tribunal will now ask questions from you. For the tribunal's information, Wang Zhu and others were invited to come to this tribunal and give evidence, but none of them had responded. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mattis. You outline very clearly a process by which people are having their organs removed against their will, of course. Can you identify, did your evidence identify who was removing their organs specifically, and what was their command and control or employment status?
The organ extraction is separate from organ insertion. The whole system is compartmentalized, and often the inserters or the transplant surgeons just got the organs. I mean, this is, from my point of view, the transplant surgeons are involved, are complicit, they're guilty of willful blindness, because often they don't look behind what they see as the source of the organs. I mean, that was the case. I mean, Wang Jifu, who was just mentioned, he gave an interview on TV where he said he once went to see what was going on with the source of organs, and he was so disgusted he never went again, which to me wasn't really an appropriate response. The extraction is, as I understand, I mean, I'm not a doctor, but my understanding is it's a less complicated process than the insertion, and so that it may be that people who aren't necessarily transplant surgeons can do the extraction. We do have somebody in England, Enver Tohti, who's willing to self-identify and was involved in extraction. The process, I mean, it's not 100% uniform, but the process was typically that people in prison would be immobilized through various forms of drugs. I mean, the first step in the process would be blood testing and organ examination, which was very kind of systematic and for the Falun Gong practitioners, basically to determine the blood type compatibility and the health of the organs. And then there would be this database of blood types, tissue types, organ health, and these people were in arbitrary detention. They became a vast living organ donor bank. A patient would come along with the right type of blood type or tissue type, and we were interviewing patients, and so the patients would tell us, the doctors would show up with these lists, and they'd go through these lists to see who matched their blood types. Then somebody would go into the prison, and the prisoner would be immobilized through these drugs. I've heard of the potassium being used. There would have to be anticoagulants as well. There's a kind of a drug mixture, and once they were drugged, they'd be taken to a white van, which would be at the prison, and the organs would be extracted at the prison by somebody from the hospital, and then the organs would be taken to the hospital, and the bodies would be cremated. That's the sequence. We do have some whistleblower evidence about seeing this, but I mean, one of the problems with when you get to the actual killings, it's difficult to get volumes numbers. We have anecdotal evidence, but we can't say, we don't have 100,000 witnesses or 60,000 witnesses.
Okay, so the person putting in the organ, for example, is going to be aware of a certain amount of data from that database about the quality of that organ and what they're planning to, the person they're putting it into. They will know something about the organ.
Well, I mean, the system would have to know something about the organ, obviously, but whether the individual person who's putting in the organ would know the blood type, he may just assume from what he's been told that the blood type is compatible without actually making the test himself, or even being told specifically what the blood type compatibility is.
Okay, so if we move from them to the organ brokers that were distributing or making available information about potential donors within China, or matching donor with recipient, who employed them, and how did they get the information that they need in order to manage this relationship between, say, someone in the UK or Malaysia wanting to go and have a transplant? How did they get hold of the stuff they needed to do to make that deal happen?
Well, I mean, the brokers were just business people, and what they saw is an inexhaustible supply of organs. I mean, this is what the hospitals were saying: "Come anytime, we'll give you an organ." And it was on their websites. I mean, it's all gone down now, but it's all archived. You can still see it through the Wayback Machine. And so the brokers, it was just they didn't need the data to run the business because they knew once they produced the patient, the hospital could produce the organ. I mean, you can still see this now through the body exhibits. China still produces body parts for body exhibits, and they're advertised online. I mean, those ads haven't been taken down, and they're coming from the same place that was the epicenter in Shenyang of organ transplants. And I mean, obviously, I would discourage you from doing that, but anybody in this room could just, by email, pay some money and get a body part shipped to them. And I mean, that's another manifestation of the same problem.
So if we, again, go back to this inquiries you made of all the various hospitals to identify those who might be able to provide organs from out, you know, so phoning up, as your investigators did, what was the geographical spread within China of the hospitals who responded saying they were taking Falun Gong organs?
So, throughout China, in our book, we have a map with dots where they said yes, and you can see it's everywhere.
And one more specific question from me about Annie's husband, who took. Where is he now, and what happened to him? Do you know?
Well, we never talked to him directly. He never wanted to talk to us or anybody directly. And Annie, at that time, she made the statement, was divorced from him. I mean, I don't read anything much about the relationship between her and her husband. So I've only heard anecdotal statements about where he is, but what I've heard is he's in Canada. Now, whether that's true or not, I couldn't really say.
Thank you. That's my questions.
Anybody else have any other questions? I'll add, you've got 3 quarters now, you have more time if you want to. You've reached your conclusions, Mr. Matters, and I would like help with 2 things. The total figures of enforced transplants at its highest would be what?
Well, at its highest, it's hard to say because what we were doing is looking at transplant volumes mostly of registered hospitals after the registration system was kicked in. Now, there was about 1,000 hospitals doing transplants in China before the registration kicked in. They then had an application system for registrations, and about 800 of the 1,000 applied, and initially 169 were accepted, and so there was over 600 that weren't. As far as we could tell, many of these other hospitals continued doing transplants, but in a much more underground sort of way or quiet sort of way. And we could go to the registered hospitals and add up their volumes because they were still publicly transplanting. But we couldn't go to the unregistered hospitals and add up their volumes because they were doing this without official approval or recognition. We could figure out what was the transplant volume of the registered hospitals fairly easily, just kind of adding up hospital by hospital. For the unregistered hospitals, it's hard even to make an estimate. We know that it's happening, but I couldn't say this is the maximum.
I think Professor Elliott has another question just before he does. On provable or establishable material, what numbers do you produce, and also over what period are we concerned with?
Well, basically, I started looking at this from the start of persecution. We were going by it historically, and what we could see is that numbers were going up dramatically once the persecution of Falun Gong began. There was China has 4 transplant registries for heart, liver, lung, and kidney at 4 different locations. the lung, kidney, and heart are all and always have been inaccessible to the public, but the liver transplant volumes were accessible to the public when we did our report, and so we could see that the liver volumes went way up after the persecution of Falun Gong, and we had year by year volumes. That data source was shut down after our report came out, and I even talked to the fellow Wang, who was running that registry at the time, and he said that he basically didn't like the way people were using the data, so he shut down access. But but another thing we could see, and this continues to this day, is a massive building boom. What constrained transplant volumes in China was not availability of organs; it was availability of beds, availability of doctors, availability of hospitals. So there became this kind of massive building boom for transplant hospitals or transplant wings of hospitals, increasing the bed count. And so the capacity increased year by year. We said 60 to 100,000 on the basis that in the earlier years, the capacity was limiting transplant volumes to that. In the later years, to 100,000. But and your question was the identifiable. I would say the identifiable would be 100,000, but with the unidentifiable, it could go beyond that.
So, for a program of that scale, for that building scale alone, would imply that there was some policy change somewhere which would allow that to take place. What evidence have you got for state involvement or state instruction of that program, and how was it monetized? How was it paid for?
Well, I mean, there is state evidence because the Chinese generally viewed transplant surgery as a leading edge technological development, and they gave it priority in the 5-year plans. And you can see in our in the update in 2016 the kind of status and priority the party was giving to transplant surgery. In terms of monetization, I mean, I don't have the books, but my understanding is it would have come from the sale of organs to the people buying transplants. I mean, you can see this. There was this website. It had some sort of generic name, Syntac, but it was basically in Shenyang, not in the same hospital as Annie's husband was working on, another hospital. And it starts off, and they have a website. You can the Wayback Machine trawls or scrolls data over time, and so you can see the evolution of the Syntac. And it starts off with a picture of a very old building and a small building, and later on there's a big new modern building, and they have price lists. And so I can't, as I say, I haven't seen the books, but I assume that the money is coming from the transplants.
So to be clear, when you say someone's selling these organs, is that the prison selling to the hospital, or the hospital selling to the outside world?
Well, the money, if you're using a broker, it would go to the broker. But if you're going directly to with the hospital, you'd pay the hospital, and the hospital uses the money to. I mean, it would pay the doctors, but it would also pay the prison people as well. There is a financial dimension to this, which is important. Because at the time this was happening, this boom in transplants, there was a shift in China away from socialism to capitalism, which meant the withdrawal of money from the government sector, including the health sector, so that the health system was losing money at this time because of the shift from socialism to capitalism. They need an alternative source of funds. And that source of funds became transplants, primarily. So that many of these health institutions, they were able to keep their doors open. I mean, it wasn't just funding the transplant business, it was funding their whole business. I mean, it was even happening with the military, because, I mean, in China, the military is a conglomerate business. They're allowed to raise money in any way they want. And they were raising money through selling transplants. They had transplant hospitals that many of the patients we talked to, they went to transplant hospitals. If they went to civilian hospitals, there were the patients went to military transplant hospitals. Or if they were being operated on, even in a civilian hospital, it'd often be a military surgeon. So that the money was going to the hospitals and the prisons, but it was also going to support other elements of the health system, to support the military for spending on arms. And again, this is one of the things we saw on the website before it was shut down. That the hospitals would say that they were earning a lot of money from transplants. They would say it was their primary source of funds. And of course, the amount they was charging was very large.
So the numbers here are clearly important for understanding the gap, as it were, between the donated organs and those that might come from prisoners of conscience. To the best of your assessment, could you summarise for us the numbers that might have come from death row prisoners, the number that might have come from prisoners of conscience, and the numbers that have come through the official state system, such as it is?
Well, there's a fluctuating ratio because at the beginning there was no donation system and there was no organ distribution system. If you showed up with a relative at a hospital and your relative said, I will donate a kidney, they would probably do that. But other than that, there wasn't much in the way of donations, so they were relatively insignificant. Substantially after our report came out, Chinese did set up a donation system, and it's now supposedly functioning. But again, we've had investigators calling to the donation systems, and they seem to be generating tiny numbers. They have set up something which they call a donation system, but as far as I can tell, it's a purchase and sale system. That what they do now is that they will pay relatives of patients who are accident victims that are brain dead and cardiac alive, and ask the relatives to consent to the donation of this accidented victim, and what the Chinese say now is that their transplant volumes are coming all from donations, none from executed prisoners. But what they call donations are these purchased organs from relatives, and the amount of money they're giving is also quite large. I've seen reports about 39 times annual income for family members, so it's substantial. But the accident victims, of course, if they're accidented to the point where they're brain dead, their organs, many of them, are not going to be that usable. There's no law in China allowing for organ sourcing from the brain dead cardiac alive. There's still the issue of coordination with patients, because patients can still book transplants in advance, and obviously you don't book accidents in advance. So there are some numbers there. I don't think it's, with the accident victims, I don't think it's zero or tiny the way the donations are. There is something there. With the prisoner sentenced to death, at one time we were estimating, with the 10,000 a year, we were estimating maybe 2,500 prisoners sentenced to death and the rest prisoners of conscience. Now, once our report came out on total volumes of 60 to 100,000 a year, the reaction of the government of China wasn't okay, but it's all coming from donations. They said our figures aren't real, even though it's their own hospitals, and it's all cross-checked across a variety of data streams. Their own figures are way below that. So even if they're right that everything is coming from donation, what they say is everything coming from donation is maybe 10,000, 13,000 a year. It's not 100,000 a year. So what we're dealing with in terms of prisoners of conscience, if we've got 100,000 a year, and there's 13,000 a year that's coming from donations, taking their own figures at face value, we've got, 77,000 left of prisoners of conscience.
And in the rest of the world, you wouldn't be able to do any of this stuff without some form of consent, written, usually. Have you, in discussions you've had with your inquirers or with any witnesses that you've spoken to, come across any consenting process at all that you could tell us about?
Well, after a report came out, China did enact a law saying there had to be consent, and they say there's consent. I've never seen anybody verify those consents. But what's troubling, I mean, aside from the fact it's unverifiable, is that they have a 1984 law which says you can source organs without consent, and they've never repealed that law. It's for prisoners. It's not for the population at large. It's on the theory that the families don't claim the bodies, which, of course, for Falun Gong practitioners, it's very difficult for them to claim the bodies because a lot of the Falun Gong population, they don't self-identify to protect their home environment, so that the jailers don't know who they are and the families don't know where they are. And on occasion, I mean, Wang Fu, I mean, he does a lot of public stuff. So one time he was asked about the 1984 law, and his reaction is, "How do you know about that?" You know, so like much else, this notion of consent that the Communist Party produces is I would say, it's cosmetics. It's not real.
So I'm just going to go back to your 70,000 number a few moments ago. Some of those, presumably, would be, if it was following some similar pattern to the rest of the world, would be multi-organ extractions used for more than one recipient.
Yes.
So does that alter the calculation of numbers of people involved?
Yes, that's right. At the beginning, they didn't have an organ distribution system, so there was a lot of organ wastage. There's still no patient coordination. When we talk to patients, they weren't told if they want to come at one time, come at another time, because they want to coordinate from the same source. There's, in my estimate, still a lot of organ wastage, but probably less now. So when I say 77,000, that would be 77,000 organs, not 77,000 people.
Thank you. Yeah.
Just one matter of detail. Just one matter of detail. I think you spoke of someone, presumably a doctor, reviewing lists of available tested or of test results. How close were you to the source of that evidence? Was it direct? Was it hearsay, as it's called, or hearsay on hearsay? And do you know for which hospital it related?
Well, we talked to the patient who told us what he saw. I didn't talk to the patient. David Kilgore did. I mean, my report is co-authorship with David Kilgore. So that was part of his contribution. The interview we had with that particular patient. It was kind of it was a gruesome story. It wasn't just the list. It was the fact that there was. They kept on trying different kidneys because they didn't get a match. They had to go through 8 kidneys before they got a match for this fellow.
Thank you. Mr. Matters, thank you very much for coming to the tribunal to give evidence.
Thank you.
You are, of course, free to stay and watch the remainder of the proceedings. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for inviting me.
Mr. Sabi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next witness is Jiang Yu. The witness will state her evidence in Chinese, so would you please put the earphones on and switch on the system so you can hear the evidence in its translation.
Should be seeing her here. Oh, yeah. Yes. They're connecting. So I can. Shall we not see?
Mr. Please state your name for the tribunal. Can you put the headphone on?
没有。
Oh, is it there? Yeah.
Hello. Hi, 你好。
Can you please state your name to the tribunal?
请把你的名字说一下，请说一下你的名字。
OK，我叫戴英。
My name is Dai Ying.
Yes, you and your husband were arrested following your attempt to appeal in Shenzhen City Appeals Office. Can you explain to the tribunal whether you appointed lawyers to defend your rights and what happened?
你和你的丈夫呢，就是说要上访，在深圳上访的时候呢，他们有没有同意你用律师？明白了吗？就是您和您的丈夫被抓起来的时候，当时你需要律师的时候，他们有没有同意你使用律师？
没有。
No。
我的就是我被判刑，整个没有律师，他不允许我的家人为我请律师。
Even during my detention, including my husband, I appointed one lawyer. His brother also appointed lawyer, but the Chinese government didn't allow us to have the lawyer that we wanted, and the Chinese government, they have appointed their own lawyer.
And did that lawyer that was appointed by the government of China acted for your benefit?
那么这个国家自己决定的这个律师有没有就是帮助你们？
这个律师呢，就是当时就是他们决定取消了，就是我们家属给我丈夫请的律师之后，那么他就是一个周五的晚上。
After they cancelled the lawyer that we have appointed, and around 6 o'clock in the evening, and they told us that we cannot have this lawyer, and then it was in the evening, and the lawyer is going to attend the hearing on Monday. We didn't even have the time to speak to the lawyer. The lawyer didn't have enough time to read through the file. So I hardly even had a time had opportunity to meet the lawyer.
Did the lawyer plead guilty or not guilty on your behalf?
那么这个律师就是他有没有也替你认罪？
因为开庭的时候，他是做有罪辩护，因为开庭的时候我不可以进，我到门口他们。
From the start, when the hearing started, they have already decided it will be the admitting the crime.
听我先生的哥哥说，他进去了，他是做有罪。
I wasn't allowed to go inside the courtroom, and I heard that the lawyer admitted that my husband was committed crime.
Ms. Dai, you were tortured extensively during your detention and lost one eye. Can you briefly explain to the tribunal how you were tortured?
你曾经说你被拷打，而且呢，你一个眼睛呢失明，你能不能可以解释一下，就是你所遭受的这些苦难？
对。
Yes。
我呢，就是因为我丈夫这种做法，我觉得他是非常
During what they did to my husband, it was very unlawful. I tried to appeal. I tried to find various relevant department. No one would listen to me. In the end, I had to go to the Beijing counsel to appeal. And we, as Falun Gong practitioners, are not allowed to even come close to those offices.
我能碰到哈，那就是看到我们中国的我们法轮功学是非常渴望修炼的，修炼无罪嘛哈，就在那里。
We wanted to meet some foreign journalists so they could see what is happening to the Falun Gong practitioners.
把我送到这个深圳驻北京的一个办事处。
I was arrested in Beijing and then I was sent to Shenzhen provincial bureau in Beijing, and I was detained. Then during the detention, I was tortured. And then because I was innocent and I refused food, and then they used forced feed, and it was a kind of bamboo barrel, and the end was very, very sharp. It's quite a big barrel, and that was forced into my mouth. And when they had to use a screwdriver to open my mouth, and at once when I refused to open my mouth, then they used a very large screwdriver, and that hurt my teeth, and then I lost my teeth because of that. And then I was in Guangdong women's prison. It was in a mountainous area. It is a forced reform that they force us to give up our belief, and deprived me from sleeping, and also consistently asking me to stand up. So when you stand, you have to stand facing the wall, and your tip of your nose has to be attached to the wall. And after a few days, and without sleeping, you cannot stand anymore, and then you start fall down. Every day when I have to go to toilet or bathroom, there are 4 criminals followed me all the time. And in winter time, they pour cold water. Also, they refused refused me to buy any daily, including the toilet tissue. Even when I go to toilet, I had to use water to clean myself. In every way, they try to destroy your dignity. Every single day you have to write your own thoughts, and how you reform your thoughts. How did you started this Falun Gong practice, and also how to defame the Falun Gong. one day there was a man in the surname Law. She was responsible to reform me. She said, I have been treating you very well. I am going to put you in a complete concealed sealed cell, and then you will be urinated by someone who has mental illness. If you don't reform, I will do that to you. And she said, I gave you 10 minutes to think about it, and I said, no, I don't need 10 minutes. I don't care. And on that day, I was electrocuted many times. A few days later, when I was sleeping at midnight, I was taken to a cell. Basementless. There was a youngster who brought about 4 other criminals, and I was electrocuted there. All 4 of them pressed me on the floor where I couldn't move. They started my acupuncture points, all these points, in the most sensitive points. At that time, I was in a terrible pain. My head was like as if it's going to blow up. I was screaming. I was screaming. I was electrocuted for about 20 to 30 minutes. Then I was taken back to my cell. At that time, it was dark. I didn't know, but in the morning, when I tried to look around, I couldn't see. And if I cannot see, I cannot do anything. I cannot work. And then they said that I am pretending. So I requested to have eye test. I said, you damaged my eye, and I need to have eye test. So after consistent requests, they took me to this one clinic outside. It's a normal hospital. And then I was taken to eye clinic. And the police were with me, 2 police officers. There was one of them, surnamed Deng. Once the test has completed, the police removed me from the office, but I still overheard. They said that the eye is damaged. The one eye is already lost. So when police asked that is she going to lose sight completely, and the doctor said yes, one of the eyes is already lost.
Thank you, Ms. Dai. Thank you.
好，谢谢。
You were medically tested in April 2004. Can you explain to the tribunal how the medical testing was and whether you received any result of your medical test?
你曾经说2004年的时候呢，他们给你体验，就是说检查身体，您可不可以解释一下这个 检查身体，你有没有得到这个体检的结果？
没有，对，没有，因为那时候在里面就是体检吧，我们都抽了很多血，他检查我的心脏。
During the test, they draw blood, electrocardiograph, and while they're testing my heart, and the doctor asked if I ever suffered a heart problem. So I have explained to them that I had been through extreme torture.
就是04年的5月的某一天，就给我那个检查这个我的器官，还抽血。他说你的心脏好像是不是有问题？就是他这样子哈，我说是我。
The doctor repeatedly asked, "Do you suffer from heart problem?" And I said, "I have been through extreme torture, and I do feel heartache." Then they also tested my kidney. They pressed and then banging to see if I feel pain.
我在没有练法轮功之前，我就是也有这个毛病，肾盂肾炎。
I said that before I practiced Falun Gong, I had the problem, but on that day they have extracted or drawn a lot of blood. I asked, why are you taking so much blood? They said, we will need to do many different tests. On that day, every Falun Gong members went through exactly same procedure. There was an old lady from Foshan. In a bus, they had all this equipment, and so we were taken to the bus and to have the proper test. We were over 100 Falun Gong. I think I can only say approximate number. I would be over 100, maybe 200 for this test. It was all internal, external checks, and we were in a different queue. It lasted about 2 hours. And there was one Falun Gong member who became insane, and she didn't know what was going on. But she was also forced to go through all that procedure. But we have never received any results of all these tests.
Thank you, Ms. Dai. Now the tribunal will have some questions for you.
Yang, during your time when you were imprisoned, can you describe to the tribunal whether the Falun Gong, were you separated or were there different other types of people with you, other ethnicities, religions?
就是你被关押期间，你是跟这些法轮功的学员在一起，光是法轮功的学员呢，还有其他的犯人一起被关押？
我关押呢，我关了3个地方。
I was in 3 different places, detention places.
上网回来的时候，就是在我们那个城市的一个。
In Fudianchu Detention Center, the cell was very small in that there were about 30 people. I was the only Falun Gong practitioner. During labor camp, I was the only. There were about 20 people. I was the only Falun Gong practitioner. And they deliberately separated separated Falun Gong. During reform through education, it was the same. In the cell, I was the only Falun Gong practitioner.
During your time of imprisonment, did you ever see or witness any children that were there?
就是你在关押期间有没有看到过孩子们？
我当时我没有看到，但是我知道，因为我们深圳的那个上访的也有带着小孩去上访的，他这个关押就是有被。
I haven't seen any, but I know there are people who went to appeal with their parents, and I do know there were Falun Gong members, including children, being detained.
Okay. If during the time of your imprisonment, did you ever know anyone who repented or who agreed to stop practicing the ways of Falun Gong, and were they released if they did?
被关押在监狱期间，有没有看到任何法轮功学员会承认认错，然后呢就是停止练法轮功？
有，我在劳教所的时候哈。
When I was in labor camp.
因为我们那个被就是说就是在那里。被迫的嘛哈，被迫的话呢，就是他那种痛苦哈。
Because the torture is unbearable. That you go through many different terrible experience, and sometimes your body cannot tolerate. And even giving up Falun Gong, practicing Falun Gong, it's not because they want to, but it is because they were forced. They had no other choice.
When would the guards determine whether somebody had repented, whether it was a genuine repentance?
那么就是说，这个官员们怎么会知道？就是你承认你法轮功是错误的时候，不对的时候，他们不知道哪一个人说的是诚实的，还是只是在说谎？
他们其实有一些都是被迫害的那个神志不清了，他们。拿着这个手帮签名的，都这样。
Many people after torture, they don't even know what they're doing after, especially continuous electrocuted, and also when you are deprived from sleeping. At that time, most people they don't know what they are doing. A lot of time, actually, the guards support them, helping them to sign as well. So, from my experience, everyone who repent Falun Gong is because they were forced to do so, and they feel they have that was the only option for them. Because the guards also have the quota that to reach. Because that is their task. They have to report to the above that they have managed to reform Falun Gong practitioners.
Okay. When you were taken for medical testing, did anybody ask, or did you ask why you were being tested, given medical tests?
就是你被就是说检查身体的时候呢，你有没有问他们为什么要检查身体，或者有没有听到其他的人问也为什么要检查身体？
我有问，
I did ask.
为什么给我们做这些
？Why you doing this to us, not other criminals?
其他的。
Because there are other criminals, many drug addicts and prostitutes. So I said, why didn't you? And I was told that this is actually a special treatment from the government. Even if they want to have that test, we are not going to give them.
Okay. I think, and one last question. How would you describe Falun Gong? Do you describe it as a religion, or how would you describe it?
就是最后的一个问题，就是你怎样描述法轮功？你认为法轮功是宗教还是什么？
法轮功呢，是一个佛家的一个上层的这个高的大法哈。
It's derived from Buddhism.
我们修炼的，它呢就是有5套功法，一个
There are
它就是
5 different practices, and it's about the truthfulness, forbearance, and compassion.
有5套功法啊，你如果按照他这个真善忍去要求自己，
when you practice these 5 different practice and abiding of 3 rules, which is forbearance, compassion, tolerance, and you will find you raised to in a very different level.
我呢我是20多岁5、6岁去特区吧，因为就是30多岁的时候身体非常不好。
When I was 30, I suffered from many different health problems. I couldn't even eat any kind of fruits. And my body had some kind of dysfunction. So I started. When I went to the hospital to check my health, after I practiced, when I improved, and when I went to the hospital to check, they were really surprised how my health has improved.
Is that do you think that is the reason why they test on the Falun Gong?
你认为是因为这个原因，他们要检查法轮功人员的身体？
对，他就是那时候还没有迫害啊，那时候没有迫害，就是迫害之前，我因为我的那个身体不好，我练了法轮功哈。
At that time, the Falun Gong was legal, and I was practicing, and all the Falun Gong people who practiced Falun Gong, they have a good health.
就是他一看也确实通过检查。
Even the doctor also was surprised and convinced that practicing Falun Gong is good for health.
还有呢，就是我在单位，原来我是在一个深圳市一个物质总公司上班，非常好的一个单位。
My workplace was in Shenzhen. The place where I worked, it was very good.
最多，搞得我也很没面子。所以呢，我通过修炼之后，我的身体好了，我也没有再报医药费，因为我身体
During when I was working there, I always had a health problem. But after practicing Falun Gong, my health improved, and even my boss was very surprised.
Thank you.
谢谢。
Thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the tribunal. You are, of course, free to stay and attend the remaining proceedings.
好，谢谢给我们提供证据。当然，您可以继续听我们其他的项目，或者呢，您可以自由离开。谢谢。
好，谢谢。
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, our next witness is Ms. Feng Hollis, who would also state her evidence in Chinese, so you can keep the headphones on.
Sorry. Yeah, it's your turn.
I don't know what he said.
Good afternoon, Ms. Feng. My name is Sabi, and I will be asking questions on behalf of the tribunal. You have submitted your report, your statement. It's in the book in front of you, page 37.
Mr. Sabi, I should have asked the previous witness, and I will ask this witness, if you don't mind.
This is not mine.
Oh, no, that's wrong. There's a book in front of you.
Oh, this one?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Before you give your evidence, can I just ask you to remember that it is very important to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Ms. Feng, are you going to give your evidence in English or in Chinese?
我说中文吧。
In Chinese.
You were arrested in March 2005 and imprisoned in 3 different detention centers until September 2006. Is that correct?
是的，对。
Is that
Yes.
Were you arrested solely for being a Falun Gong practitioner?
Yes, 是的。
Was there any legal process where you were found guilty of any crime?
没有任何的
There was no legal process through which I was
就是在
detained.
我被抓起来以后呢，
After I was
我
detained,
被关到我们当地的这个拘留所。
I was detained in the local
在
detention
那里
center.
待了40天的第40天，
On the 40 days after my
有一个女
detention,
的
there was a
就
woman
来到我
came
待的这个房间的
to my cell.
外面。
She
这个
stood
房
outside
子
of the
呢
cell.
是一个铁门，但是
Uh,
从外面可以看到。
The room had an iron gate,
这时候她就拿
but
出
she
来
could see
一
me
张
from
纸
outside. And she took out a piece of
我
paper.
被抓起来以后呢，
After I
没
was
有律
detained,
师，也
I didn't
不
have a
允许
lawyer,
申诉。
and I was denied
在
right of
所以
appeal.
到第40天的时候呢，
So on the 40th
她就来
day,
到我的这个
she came to
待的这个房间的
the
外面，
cell I
然
was
后就
staying.
开始读，
She was reading
说
out
因为练法轮功被判2年
a
劳
verdict
教，
that
所
said
以这个整个的这个过程
because I was
中没有
Falun
任
Gong
何
practitioner, I was sentenced to 2 years of re-education through labour.
Did you have a copy of that verdict with you?
Yes. This is the original Chinese, and this translation.
Ms. Feng, would you explain to the tribunal briefly how you were tortured during your detention
您能不能向我
in
们
these
解释一
different
下
camps?
您具体是怎么受到折磨的？
那在拘留所的时候呢，
During the detention my time in
有一个
detention
警
center,
察呢，他
there was a
需要
policeman
就是问我问题，
who
就
needed
叫
to ask me a
提
few
审嘛
questions
提审，提审完了之
in
后
order
呢，
to make
他
me
让
more
我
awake.
在这个提审上面签字，
Sorry.
签上我的名字。
He asked me to
我
sign
跟
a
他讲
document.
呢，修炼法轮功呢是没有罪的。
I told him
所以
clearly
呢
that
我呢也拒绝
practicing
承
Falun
认这
Gong
种
was
对
not a
我的
crime,
非法抓捕。
so I refused to
所以我说我不
confess
会
to any
签字
crime.
的。
So I said I
这
would
个时候
refuse
呢，
to
他
sign
就
anything.
揪住我的衣服，
At the time, he pulled my clothes and knocked me against the wall and kicked me and pretended to slap me and insulted me with very dirty language. On the 42nd day, when I received the verdict from the detention center, I was sent to Beijing's women's labor camp. They tried a lot to force Falun Gong practitioners to give up their belief. There were two police people who were responsible for me. They didn't let me sleep. I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning every day. A lot of the police force were not working, had not started working. I was forced to sit on a small stool, watching a video program slandering Falun Gong. And then, when they came to work, they started talking to me until midnight, even 1 o'clock in the morning or 2 a.m. Because I refused to give up Falun Gong. After 2 months, I was sent to a so-called intensive assault unit. There were more cruel ways of torture to force us to renounce our faith. Before I was arrested, I was working in real estate. Working in antique shop. I had my own antique shop in a street in Beijing. I often came to the UK for business. After I was arrested, the international media reported on my case, so the Chinese police knew that I had connections abroad. Falun Gong practitioners in the intensive assault unit were watched over by drug addicts. The policeman told the drug addicts, asked the drug addicts not to hit me, and told me that they would torture me leniently. First of all, I was denied food. Was not given enough food. Every meal, the amount of food amounted to half a piece of steamed sour bun and 2 spoonfuls of porridge, which was practically a mixture between rice and water, only 2 spoonfuls, and there was nothing else. That was the first way of torture. Second, it was summer when I was detained, during my detention. In Beijing, the temperature went up to 40 degrees Celsius, and I was only allowed two small glasses like these of water, and there was not enough water. And the third point is that I was not allowed to sleep. It was not only not allowing me to sleep, I was forced to sit on a plastic stool without a backrest. There was a specific way I should sit. I had to close my legs and the tips of my toes had to be together as well. I had to sit straight, and my hands had to be placed on my lap, and I was not allowed to close my eyes, not allowed to move. If I dared to move, if I had to move, I had to report to the drug addict who was watching over me. For example, report, I need water. If he said yes, then I was allowed to drink. Afterwards, I had to report to the drug addict to gain permission to put down the glass. If I was allowed, if he said yes, then I was allowed to put down the glass. That is to say that without permission, I was not allowed to make any movement. Because it was summer at the time, when I was sitting on the stool, starting from the second week of such torture, my backside hurt, and I was and then I was not allowed to wash my hair or take a shower or wash my clothes when the temperature was 40 degrees. Such was not allowed. After 2 weeks, I was very smelly. My clothes were very smelly because of the sweat, and my scalp was itching, and I couldn't sleep. If I scratched my scalp, if I wanted to scratch my scalp, I had to report it to, or I had to ask for permission. Because there was not enough food to eat, or water to drink, and not enough sleep. My health condition had already gone down. I collapsed a few times. I fainted a few times. And I was not allowed to go to the toilet. If I asked for permission to go to the toilet, I had to wait for half an hour, sometimes 2 hours. Then I lost, the result of this is that I lost sensation in my bladder, and I didn't even know when I wanted to go to the toilet. 3 drug addicts were monitoring me 24 hours. Each of them had an 8-hour shift. They were responsible for recording all my moves. For example, when I drank water, how much water I drank. If I talked to anyone, if yes, what I talked about, what my facial expression was like, if I was happy or not, everything had to be recorded.
Thank you, Ms. Thank you. Can you explain to the tribunal whether you received any medical examination, how many times, and whether you ever received the result of your medical examination?
When I was at the detention center, as far as I remember, every 3 or 4 months there was a physical examination. We were dragged to a police hospital very close to the detention center every 3 to 4 months. The examination included weight, height, blood pressure, and blood drawing. They had to put the blood in small test tubes of the drawing of blood and scanning of kidneys
胸部的 X 光
and
检
chest
查，
X-ray
还有心电图检查。
and cardio electrogram.
有1到2次呢，是不允许早晨起来，不允许喝水。
Once or twice, we were not allowed to drink water or eat food when we woke up
有大概1到2次。
for the sake of
我在劳
physical
教所一共待了
examination.
有1年半的时间。
I was in the detention center for 1 year and a half.
大概3到4
In
次。
total, I was examined 3 or 4 times.
有一个定期的检查。
There was a regular check, regular physical examination.
Ms. Wang, did you ever receive the result of the medical examination?
请问你有没有收到这个体检的结果？
从来都没有。
Never,
从来都
never.
没有。没有人告诉我们。
No one told us
你这个检测的指标是什么？然后你
whether
哪里有问题？从来没有。
the results were normal and if there was something wrong with us.
因为我想补充一点，就是
I want to
说
add that
我当时由于他们的这种就是完全剥夺了我这个
because
就
of
生存
the
的这种
complete
自由。
deprivation of my freedom
这个饭和水都不够情况，当时我在晕倒了。
I
然后他们
fainted
就从劳教
once
所的叫来一个护士，
and they
给我检查。
dispatched a nurse to
他不
check
告
on me
诉我任何情况，就是说你晕倒了，你是因为什么情况？
and the nurse didn't tell
然后他就给我
me
吃
the
药。
reason of my
我说这个药是什么
fainting
药？
and I was given a
没有
drug.
因为我们在那里
I
面
was
如
given
果说
medication.
某一个法
I
律
was
学
not
员身体出现
aware
问
what
题
the medication
他
was.
强制吃药是不告诉我们这个药是什么，
They forced us to take
治的是
medication
什么
without telling
病，
us what the
没有
medication
人
was
知道，
and what
就
the
是强制你吃。
what conditions the medication was for. They simply just forced us to take medication.
Did any other prisoners apart from Falun Gong practitioners medically tested?
对，也都有。
Yes.
我们所有的
All
法
of
轮
them.
功学员
All
都
of
被做体
all of
检
us
的。
Falun Gong practitioners
我们当时每一
were
次去的
physically
时候，
examined.
都是坐在这个一个 coach 很大的一个 coach。
We were sitting in the coach
然后呢，
every time we were taken
去
for
的时候，
taken
他
for
们把那
examination,
个 coach 里面的窗帘全部都给拉起来。
and they would
拉起来
draw
之
all
后
the
呢，
curtains
我
in
们
the
要是
coach.
被强制呢，双手呢放在前一个座位的上面，
We had to put our
然后
hands
头要低下来。
on the.
所以
We had
呢
to get into
就
brace
是
position.
其实坦率的说呢，是不知道给拉到哪一个医院。
Frankly speaking, I didn't know. No one
但是
knew
因为
where we
我
were taken.
后来被
which
这
hospital
个，
we were
后来
taken to.
我单独有2次，因为脚有问题
There were
了，
twice when
走
I
不了
had
路
a problem with my
他们给
feet.
我放在那个这个，给我单独带到医院里边去
They
检查
took
的
us.
时候，
They
我
took
这个
me.
才知道那个医院就是我们每一次法轮功学员做体检的那个医院，也是公安的医
They
院。
took me to the hospital, and then I realized which hospital we were taken to every time, and even that hospital was affiliated to the police force and not independent hospital.
Thank you. The question is whether, or to your knowledge, was anybody who was not a Falun Gong practitioner subject to the same medical tests?
有没有受到这样的体检？
我没有看到
I
其他
didn't
的
see other
因为在劳教所里面
inmates
那些犯人
who were
呢，他
physically
们是
checked.
他们的任务呢是，因为3个犯人要监视一
The
个
responsibility of
法轮功学员
other
嘛，所以
inmates
他有1个人在值班的时候，另外2个人要长期在屋里面睡觉。他
were
们
managed to look
这
over
些
the
犯
Falun
人
Gong
的
practitioners.
这些其他的不是法轮功学员，这些犯人他们就睡觉，所以我们在体检
The other
没
inmates
有看到这些人。
would be sleeping while we were being physically examined, so I didn't see any of the non-Falun Gong practitioners. I mean, the other being examined.
Thank you, Ms. Wang. Now the tribunal has some questions for you.
反正其他成员想问你一些问题。
Thank you very much. 2 or 3 questions for you. The first is, whilst you're in detention and these checks, medical checks were being carried out on you, did you have any idea why these checks were being carried out? And whilst you were in detention, did you hear any evidence of organ transplanting in the prisons?
知不知道有没有听说过活体器官摘除的这件事情？
我在那个劳教所的时候还没有听说过。
When I was in detention, so when I was in labor camp, I had not heard about it.
就是说他
But I always had a doubt.
就很严酷的，就是催遣
Why,
这些法轮功学员。
on the one hand, they were torturing us so cruelly, but on the other hand, they were checking us so regularly and never told us the results of our physical examinations.
因为有很多老年的法轮功学员，
There were a lot of senior practitioners of Falun Gong, and they had high blood pressure. In general, their health condition was not good.
有一个老年学员就当时
But because they never renounced their faith, one of the elderly practitioners fainted, and he was given medication, but he was not told what the medication was for.
所以我听这第一次听说这个。
Well, the first time I heard about organ harvesting was after I was released in 2006. At the end of 2006, when I arrived in the UK, that was the first time I heard about organ harvesting. And then I was wondering why I had not heard about. Then I was wondering, looking back, why I was being physically checked during detention. And it was strange to me because Falun Gong practitioners don't smoke or drink alcohol.
Thank you. Whilst you were in detention, did you see any children in these prisons?
No, I didn't see any children.
And whilst you were in detention, did you see or witness sexual violence against any Falun Gong? No, I didn't witness any. Because even if such things happened, I would be shielded from it. They wouldn't allow me to see such things. I was in isolation for a long time. There was a curtain on the door. The drug addicts, because they knew I had overseas connections, I was not allowed to go close to the window. Even the drug addicts who were looking over me, they were telling me that the police didn't allow me to go close to the window or the door. Because Falun Gong practitioners like me, who don't want to give up their faith, we were jailed habitually with drug addicts. You've stated that the medical testing was carried out exclusively on Falun Gong, and you've also said that there were some older, I think you described it as elderly Falun Gong practitioners in prison. Were they tested on as well, or was it only young practitioners?
All Falun Gong practitioners underwent such checks. But some of the Falun Gong practitioners, they were jailed for a long time. So I didn't witness, I didn't see if they were taken away for physical checks. When we were, every time we were checked, we had to stand in a queue. We were followed by so many policemen in the front, in the middle, and the back, and we were not to turn around or look to our sides. We were only allowed to look to the front. So I was not aware who eventually received physical examination, because we were not allowed to look around.
Although, as you've just said, you weren't aware of who was being examined, were you aware of prisoners in prison with you who disappeared during your time in detention?
您知不知道你有些犯人法轮功的学员有没有听说过他们被消失的这个事情？
我是因为我长期被单独关押嘛。
Because I was in isolation for a long time, I'm not sure that I know.
上厕所的时候。
But every time I went to the toilet, I was escorted by 2 drug addicts, one in front of me, one behind me. They had to guarantee, they had to make sure that there was no one but me in the toilet. And on my way back. That is why the police told the drug addicts who were looking over me not to allow me to go close to the windows. There's something that they call training group. We were put in a room 2 square meters and very narrow space, narrow area. The reason why I now know about what happened inside. At the end of 2005, it was the 24th of November, because my friends overseas were raising my case. So my case received the attention of the UN, and the UN dispatched 2 experts to come to see me at the detention center, at the labor camp. There was a lady called Naomi. She is also a British citizen. She lives in the UK. After I was released, I met with her, and she told me everything that happened in the training group. Because our building was such that the training group was opposite us, was like that. And during the night, I used to be able to hear shrieking, screaming, moaning in the building. And UN human rights organizations wanted to know how Falun Gong practitioners were treated in the labor camp. The policemen, before such UN investigations, certain people were dragged away in 4 vans before such investigation started. I didn't see, but I did hear Falun Gong practitioners shouting, Falun Gong is good. And but the policemen stuffed cloth in their mouths. But as to whether anyone was disappeared, I'm not sure, because I was watched over very closely. I was monitored very closely, but people overseas would know.
Could you tell the tribunal why you were released and how did that happen?
I also want to add that when I was arrested, during my detention, we were jailed, we were put in individual cells, so we were not allowed to communicate between us Falun Gong practitioners. There was a policeman and 4 former Falun Gong practitioners. Before the verdict, they came to me to talk to me. In total, they talked to me for 3 days from 9 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the evening, trying to force me to renounce my faith. But because there were no other Falun Gong practitioners in the detention center, I was the only person, I was the only Falun Gong practitioner who received such talks. I didn't know why. Then there was someone from the State Security, Domestic Security Division. The leader came to me that they didn't want to sentence me, but he didn't tell me why. And then on the 25th April, I was transferred to Beijing Women's Labor Camp because of constant hunger and thirst and sleep deprivation. Towards the end of July, at the time I had already started to lose my mind. And I was forced to renounce my faith. To say that I renounced my, and I did say, after I said that I renounced my faith, then the leader of the state security came to me again 3 times, because I was forced to give up my faith. He came to me 3 times, and this time he was very clear. At the end of this was at the end of July 2005. If you become a special agent for us and serve us, we will release you immediately. The first time I refused to talk to him, and the second time I said I would never do such a thing. The third time, every time he came, he would bring with him a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist said to him that this woman would never do it, so he never came again. But he said to me that he told me that if I gave up my faith and work for us, and report for us. I asked what report. He said every report. I said I would not do such a thing, and he never came. But he said that if you work for us, we will release you immediately. And then, the reason why I was released, I think it was due to international pressure at the time, because a lot of international media reported on Falun Gong practitioners, and I was one of the practitioners who were forced to give up our faith, and I was forced to slander my guru, my teacher, and my faith. And for this reason, I was released.
And there's one last question from one of my colleagues. If you are still in contact with other Falun Gong practitioners, or indeed you are familiar with the situation in China, can you say whether the treatment of Falun Gong has changed under Premier Xi?
请问你有没有跟国内的法轮功学员还有联系？那你能不能说，现在习近平的这个领导下，就是法轮功的对法轮功的迫害有没有所改变？
我现在和国内的法轮功学员还有联系。
I'm still in contact with Falun Gong practitioners in China. At the time,
都是在释放之后呢
my fellow practitioners, after their release, they were jailed for a second time or third time to re-education through labor. In 2013, I think it was in 2013, the re-education through labor system was abolished, and they were taken to legal school, and it was like a brainwashing training camp, aiming at renouncement of faith. And but after them, some of them were in prison. And from among the Falun Gong practitioners that I personally know, a lot of them are in prison. The situation has not changed at all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming to the tribunal to give evidence. You are, of course, free to stay and watch the remainder of the proceedings. Mr. Sabi, we sit again at 1:45.